I was a business designer, which is probably the coolest designation that I've had.
No, you can't afford a cappuccino.
Yeah.
What do you need to do?
Yeah.
You might get a sasta coffee machine.
Because eventually, if you're not a techie or even if you're techie,
Yeah.
you can build a product when you're 25.
Correct.
But before you build that product, you need that mindset.
In business class using lounges. As an entrepreneur, you're at the back of the plane right next to the stinky toilet.
Yeah.
Can you do that for a 15-hour flight?
As a 0 to 1 founder, your ability to sell is so important.
Do I start a product company straight up?
Yeah.
Or do I start a services company?
And that unlearning first requires you to really drop your ego.
Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to welcome you to this podcast. We have a very interesting guest today. Adithya, Pushkar and me are hosting as usual. Adithya, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Adi, I think first and foremost, you've done a lot of things in your life and very, very disparate things at different times. So I think one of the things that Pushkar and me would love to know about is your career from your undergrad to what you've done work experience-wise, your masters, your foray into entrepreneurship. I think this could be a 4-hour podcast, but we need to comprise it a little bit. But Adi, why don't you give us a snapshot about who you are and where you come from?
Yeah, no, delighted to be here and look forward to this conversation. My career has been quite all over the place, sometimes as I think it should be. I started out as a teacher. That was my first job, full-time, grade 4 and 5. It actually till date is the best job that I've done. I just deeply enjoyed it. This was in Bombay. So did that for about a couple of years. Was in education for some time. 4 saal mein education mein tha, so I was in education for 4 years. Then I moved to the US, studied public policy at Harvard, which was great. In the middle of my master's, had a chance to go to Jordan and work with the Queen's team.
Wow.
In Amman, which was fascinating. And they were building a teacher training policy for Jordan at that time. And it was great, just a really hardcore sort of public policy experience. Came back to the Kennedy School, which is where I went, which is, the Harvard Kennedy School. Went into impact investing for about 2.5 years after that at Draper Richards Kaplan, which is Bill Draper, Tim Draper, same sort of family. They've got an impact investment fund. So did that. And then I had a really interesting manager at DRK who was like, look, man, you're like 28. And there's entrepreneurs that are much older than you and much more experienced than you that are just listening to some faltu gyan you're giving them. And because you haven't built a company, you've never been an operator, you don't know what it feels like to hire a team, to fire a team. But because you hold the gateway to a significant number of US dollars, people will listen to you and people will be like, wow, kya baat boli yaar aapne, sahi hai, hame yahi karna chahiye. But I just think that, most people at DRK, in fact, a lot of the associates that I worked with, all went on to become entrepreneurs because that's what DRK encouraged. Ki ye kar lo aap, do it for 2 or 3 years, but then go on and do your own thing. And whether you succeed or fail, that's fine. But at least you'll have some lived experience. And then you come back into sort of, investing. So started a AI company. We actually started in EdTech, Akarshan AI. So we built Hushl. That was the company that I started in.
But interestingly, you had a stint at IDEO before that as well, right?
Correct, I did. So between DRK and Hushl, I was at IDEO, which is a product design firm. And I had, a very interesting role there. I was a business designer, which is probably the coolest designation that, I've had. It's one of those, BS designations, but you're a business designer. The role there was, so IDEO was a hardcore design team. Mm-hmm. And what often happens with designers is that they get really passionate about the beauty, the aesthetics, the desirability of the product. And we used to do both hardware as well as software. And the client would be thrilled. They'd be like, wow, what a product. And we'd sort of launch it and customers would love it. But there isn't enough business thinking that's gone into the product. And so, if you built a solar lamp, you haven't thought through the value chain, you haven't thought through the supply chain,
Okay.
And so you do it in a lab and then you give it to a client. And so they needed someone, especially because we were doing a lot of fintech work. At that time, you actually need someone who understands just, debt and numbers and, is able to look at, financials and in a certain way.
And that was all for Africa.
Correct. So the studio was in Nairobi.
Okay.
Wow.
And so I was building, I had an all Kenyan team. And so I was the only sort of, Indian guy there. And the culture of IDEO and in general of the startups and, other folks that I met in Nairobi is damn good. Yeah. Like I feel like they are people that generalize kar raha hoon, but I feel like they're people that take their work seriously, but they don't take themselves seriously. It's a very jolly culture, And so that was delightful, and you need that when you have a design studio. You need a little bit of banter, and there's some creativity that needs to be in the air.
Right.
So did that, and so understood how products work really well. And so teamed up with Akash, got into Entrepreneur First. So quit IDEO when I got into Entrepreneur First. This was their 7th cohort in Bangalore. Met Akash on day 1. We started out in EdTech because my passion was in education and sort of still remains in education. It's a sector I feel strongly about. We spoke to a couple of investors who said EdTech and all is dead, boss. Koi tumko paisa waisa nahi dene wala hai. Good. Acha hai tum log.
But that is like post 2022, I presume, right?
This was in 2022.
Yeah.
This was in 2022. They were like 4 years ago, was probably the right time. But like, dekh lo aap log, EdTech mein karna hai, nahi karna hai. And so we were also first-time entrepreneurs. And so we said, okay. And so then we sort of pivoted and went into AI and then went into the creator economy and explored a few other sort of spaces. Built a really nice product that was at the intersection of AI and marketing. Launched it, got about 7,000 users. And this was pre-ChatGPT. And then the day that ChatGPT launched, Akash and I were just on the phone. Like on that one phone call went on for like 6.5 hours. We were like, ye kya bana diya, bhai? Because at that time, nobody thought they would go into, like now it's common knowledge, right? Like you think of ChatGPT and OpenAI, but at that time, you didn't think they were going into consumer applications. And so then they did. And so then we pivoted. And now we're an AI services company. So I did that. And then moved and, we've got an office not too far away from here. So we do AI services now with Hushl. And then earlier this year, I went back into education. And so this was...
so it's like full circle. You've been in education.
So full circle, yeah. Like I love education and healthcare, man. Like I feel like just the two sectors, there's just so much science to it and there's they're beautiful sectors. So I enjoy sort of both of them. And so been with an education company in Ahmedabad as their CEO for a while now. I'm transitioning out and we'll probably do another 0 to 1, but that's a little bit of the journey. I think now I see myself largely as an operator. Like I feel like I got into it because I thought kabhi shayad investing mein wapas jaunga. The operator thing is just too much fun, yeah. Like it's just,
of course,
it's beautiful. So now I'm just, I think, trying to find the next thing to sink my teeth into. Yeah.
But how did you become so passionate about education and tech? वो कैसे हुआ?
Yeah, just happened by chance.
So you studied media, right?
What did you study?
So in undergrad, I majored in journalism.
Okay.
मैंने science करा 11th and 12th में, and then
like all Indian kids,
like all Indian kids just did science. And then like 80% of Indian kids engineering nahi karna tha. And so then just fought with my dad, and I remember him being damn irritated. Like he was like, kya yaar, aap engineering karo? And then he was like, theek hai, kya karna hai? And I was like, main media karunga.
Wow.
And dad was like, "Arey, mujhe laga BBA karega ya BCom karega. Ye kya baat hui?" And this was in 2009, right? Like it was so risky and
right. Prim and proper, Tambram. That's what you expected to do.
Correct. Like
either numbers or going to medicine, like or engineering. Yeah.
Conservative Tamilian family. And so then, anyway, so sort of, fought with them and said, nahi, apna passion follow karna hai, to yehi karunga. And then sort of, and it was beautiful actually. My time so I went to Symbiosis in Pune.
Wow.
And it was a very rich experience. I don't know if it was a rich academic experience, but it was a really rich life experience. Because you just had a bunch of people from across the country that just come into Symbiosis. And it was 3 years of a very nice liberal arts curriculum.
Okay.
So did that. It really sort of opened my mind. And then one of my internships was a communications internship at Teach for India.
Okay.
Which is an education nonprofit.
Sure.
That's fairly large and, operates in the education sector. And there I was really passionate because even when I decided to do journalism, it was out of, I really wanted to, I think, make a difference. It was, you're 18, 19, 20, you're quite idealistic at that point. Right. And you're like, अच्छी सी reporting करनी है यार, अच्छी stories break करेंगे.
Impact has always been a theme.
Impact has been a big thing for me, like all the way through. Like even now, I actually think that even when you do for-profit work, like the companies that really inspire me are the ones that do both profit and impact. So you're right, that's been sort of a thread throughout. And anyway, did the communications internship and was just really fascinated with what Teach for India was doing at the time. And so just couldn't stop thinking of it when I came back. And so then again called dad and said, Papa, abhi main teacher banunga. So at that point, like he's like, ek lakka to haath se gaya. Because my elder sister's sort of done the, went to Singapore for undergrad, worked for the Royal Bank of Scotland, went and got an Ivy League MBA at Columbia, then went into BCG in consulting, then is now at Expedia. Like it's the, it's the
perfect track.
Clean. Yeah, it's beautiful. Ye journalism kar raha hai. Fir ek din phone karke bol raha hai, isko teacher banna hai. So then I think, and then when I became a teacher, I was just fascinated. I mean, for the first 2 or 3 months, I thought I was doing really well because I thought a lot of teaching was about performance. And hota hai thoda bahut because I could just tell that my kids were really engaged. Okay. And then I had a really nice manager who came into my classroom and said, Bhai, tum entertaining to ho, but education has significantly more science to it. So she taught me a lot about like just pedagogy. And how you teach and how you structure your lesson plan and how you use data and how you do differentiated instruction. So that's when I went into just the science of education or how people learn and like all sorts of things. And in that ways, it was a really rich experience. So that's, I think, where, just my passion for education came.
Wow. So Pushkar, one of the things that really stands out with Addy, and I've known him for a couple of years now, is that you put him in unstructured situations with rational, irrational, creative people. He's able to pull people together to kind of come up with a framework, come up with a structure, get people to think in boxes, but at the same time not lose your creativity and flair. And I'm always curious to understand, how did he get that thought process? I mean, it's not because of an Ivy League education or whatever, but he's obviously been through chaos to understand how to structure things. Is that a fair assessment?
That is, मुझे लगता है पापा को एक बार explain कर दिया ना कि journalism करना है और फिर education करना है. Like, that's I needed to come up with frameworks and justify why I was doing what I was doing. Like, I think once you do this stuff, you have to explain so much to so many people. I think teaching also helps. So much of, in that way, I think journalism and teaching are in a lot of ways the same thing. What is journalism, right? Like, especially as a broadcast journalist, you have to take a lot of information and simplify it for an audience. It's also what teaching is. Maths bhi to yahi hota hai ki bahut complicated information hai and then you have to simplify it for a certain audience. So I think teaching, you just have to explain things well. So I think thoda bahut shayad wo teaching experience se shayad aa gaya. Yeah.
So for you, teaching was always more of a science. That how do you learn to teach, right? This is what you did at Teach for India?
Yeah, 100%. I think, like I said, the first 3 months, it was a little performative. You're playing games and kids are having fun, which is also important and necessary because the kids like you. But there is a science to it. There is a science to how we learn. There is a science to teaching. Even just if you look at lesson plans or you look at assessments, like there's formative assessment, summative assessment, there's so much science in education and what you do in a classroom that can just raise the floor of a classroom, that I think the science of the pedagogy of it, both or in all three things, in planning and planning also, right? Like how do you plan your lesson? How do you plan your week? How do you plan your unit? And in middle school, you get to teach multiple subjects. So how do you make it interdisciplinary? Then there's science in the actual delivery of it. How do you make sure that all kids are engaged? And there's multiple intelligence theory. Like how do you do differentiated instruction? Most classrooms में क्या होता है? First benchers को सब कुछ समझ आ जाता है. Middle benchers कहीं tuition जाते हैं और back benchers तो मस्ती ही कर रहे हैं. So how do you even like arrange just the design of the classroom? How do you get kids to like face you? Like what does science say about like just this almost this factory system of bench ke baad bench versus if you just move your benches around, there's so much that you can, small things that you can do. Like even things like one of my favorite things is also just taking 10 minutes at the end of the day to recap the whole day. Like summarizing a day, even if this is something that a teacher does in the classroom, which doesn't happen, right? You have one, right. But agar class teacher वापस आता है and just gets children to recap कि अच्छा पहले बताओ कि maths में क्या हुआ? ये हुआ आपका ठीक है. What did you learn in history today? Awesome. What did you all learn in science today? Like just even the ability to summarize and recall information on a regular basis. And then of course there's a whole science to assessments. And then feedback. And so there's a lot of science in education, which is wonderful. Yeah, sure. It's beautiful.
So 0 to 1 would have been natural because the way I think about it is, so my mom was a teacher all her life. My dad taught in his formative years. So essentially, teaching is, you're basically molding, doing 0 to 1s with kids in your classes and you're getting real-time feedback, right?
Yeah.
So you know whatever you're doing, how it's impacting their lives in terms of both grades as well as their personality
Yeah.
on a daily, weekly, monthly term period, right?
Yeah.
So 0 to 1 journey is easy for you, Addy.
Yeah, it's a nice analogy. I mean, even you're right. I feel like also as a teacher, the unknowns are so many.
Yeah.
कि कभी कोई बीमार हो गया, आपकी community में डेंगू फैल गया, बारिश हो गई. Like we also at Teach for India, you also teach in sort of low resource environments. So you have to be really entrepreneurial when you're teaching children that come from low resource settings. So I guess now that I reflect on it even right now, I realize that teaching experience actually was very foundational, I think, for me in the early years that probably helped with entrepreneurship in some ways. Yeah.
But you just mentioned unknowns. And
Yeah.
of course, we all know that framework, known knowns, unknown.
Yeah.
So as a founder, operator, there's always so much that is unknown, right?
Yeah.
And you don't even know you don't know about.
Yeah.
So how do you handle that? Do you have a framework saying कि यार मुझे पता नहीं क्या होने वाला है, but I'm always preparing yourself for it? Do you do something like that? Because I think most founders struggle with that.
Yeah. 100%. And it's in fact the conversation we were having before, right? Like I guess as a first-time entrepreneur, मैं non-technical founder, so coding नहीं आता था, but I had a really sort of smart CTO with me, Akash. I knew product really well. And फिर मुझे लगा यार, especially if you work in corporate and all of that, ना आपको लगता है कि आप अच्छी अंग्रेजी बोल लेते हो, तो sales marketing तो हमारी communication ही तो है ना भाई. Then when you jump into it was when you realize that there's so many different aspects of it, like how you sell, and there's multiple different frameworks. So I think in my first sort of 6 months, that was a huge learning curve for me, which is that just the ability to speak or to communicate doesn't actually translate into like marketing or like sales or being able to like sell, right? Like you almost think there's like foundationally yaar hai cheeze main ye wo seekh jaunga or you'll hire for it, but I don't think I had the ability to, as a 0 to 1 founder, your ability to sell is so important because you have nothing. You don't have a brand. Like now I just did a 1 to 10 because the education company that I was with has like 23 years of vintage. So their selling is so much easier. It's established, tumhare relationships hai, all of that. But when you do a 0 to 1 as a first time founder, I just think it's really hard. So at that time, I didn't even know ki kya unknowns hai. Like if there are 100 tasks that a founder needs to know, even legal. Like I feel like if you're an employee, aap employment contract koi padha nahi hai. Aap bas sign karke de dete ho. But when you get investment terms, like you don't have the legalese to sort of read it or understand it. Even when you do sales contracts, वो आपको पता नहीं होता है. Performance marketing क्या चीज होती है, वो आपको सही तरीके से पता नहीं होता है. Like so, I think at that time the unknowns were many. I think now अभी मोटा framework है कि अच्छा ये 100 चीजें हैं अलग-अलग. These are the different things that one needs to know, and these are the things that I know. These are the things I have networks for, and these are a few things that I may not sort of know or have access to. But I don't know if I have if I had a framework at that time, or if anyone showed me a framework. Like I wish at some point somebody just said, buddy, you're a first-time entrepreneur. Here's 100 things you need to know, right? And I think you and your co-founder know 65 of these.
Right.
And then these you don't know.
What are the gaps?
And these are the gaps. And I think Antler does a reasonable job of this.
Okay.
They have a framework where I think they get, I think one of the things, because a couple of my friends are, Antler's invested in them and I speak to them a lot. And I think Vignesh from Hexo was telling me that, when they came together, one is I think Antler doesn't say that you need the traditional CEO, CTO. For every company, sometimes you need 3 co-founders.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you need 1. You just have to figure out what your gaps are, right?
Exactly.
Like it's not that traditional thing. So I think there's a lot of value in helping first-time founders understand what they know and what they don't know. And I wish there was a framework.
And especially, I mean, you talked about Antler, interesting, but if you typically have somebody who's got 10 years or 15 years of corporate experience, jumping into entrepreneurship, that's again a first-time founder.
Yeah.
He would have to unlearn a lot of things, and like even ordering a cappuccino was very easy for him.
Yeah.
As a founder, you can't afford a cappuccino.
Yeah.
What do you need to do?
Yeah.
You might get a sasta coffee machine.
Yeah.
Or the guy comes, gives you coffee.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to say that sometimes that unlearning just because you're older,
Yeah.
you have a lot of biases that you need to shed, right?
Yeah.
When you
Exactly.
jump into that founder's shoes.
Yeah.
Because end of the day, it is eventually the amount of breath you can hold
Yeah.
for as long as you can hold
Yeah.
and figure out when you come up, can you really jump?
Yeah.
Pretty much, right? So it's always it's easy to say from the outside, but once you're stuck in it,
Yeah.
you have to really understand quickly, dude, I can't operate like this.
Yeah.
This is not going to work.
For
Or
sure.
this is going to work, right?
Exactly.
So I have a very interesting lead-up question, Addy. I mean, I've always talked to people and asked them, hey, number one, do you work for somebody else as a company before you start your entrepreneurship journey?
Yeah.
That's the first question.
Yeah.
The second question is, do I start a product company straight up?
Yeah.
Or do I start a services company?
Yeah.
Or selling, monetizing your skills?
Yeah.
Right? These two questions are probably going to add value for a lot of founders out there, right?
Yeah.
How would you think about it?
This is a great question. And I think that it depends. So one is on your first question, which is, do you work for someone else before you start your own? I think it goes either way, because to your point, if you worked for IBM for like 15 years, to your point, you have to unlearn so much. And that unlearning first requires you to really drop your ego, which doesn't happen because you've just been so valued at a corporate firm and you're very used to, I have seen employees are very used to working with resources.
Right.
Suddenly, aapke paas resource, like what is being entrepreneurial, right? Entrepreneurial is the ability to be resourceful. At IBM, you don't have to be resourceful. You just have 9 baje aap show up karo. You have to be intellectually smart, but so much of entrepreneurship is just being street smart or like dunyadari. So I think that's like
I have a test that I give some people who come to me, and it's called a stinky toilet test. And why do I call it a stinky toilet test is because as a executive 10 years, 15 years experience, you used to flying business class using lounges. As an entrepreneur, you're at the back of the plane right next to the stinky toilet.
Yeah.
Can you do that for a 15-hour flight or an 8-hour flight? It's a very simple test. If you can't pass that test, you're not allowed to be an entrepreneur.
Right.
It's a very simple thing, Pushkar, but those are and I know tons of entrepreneurs who have slept in airport lounges because they couldn't afford a hotel or all of that. That sacrifice, nobody talks about it. But that's a big sacrifice to being a founder.
Yeah.
No, back to...
So I would say, I'm thinking of this, I'm thinking out loud as I answer your question. I think big brands, I think, are sometimes almost liabilities, especially big mammoth corporates or even like Ivy League degrees and things like that, right? Like abhi to mujhe lagta hai ki thoda bahut liability hota hai in terms of, because you have to unlearn so much, and I feel like you have to truly drop your ego. So I feel like if you have relevant experience at a startup, if you worked in the early stages of Paytm or PhonePe or whatever it is, or Zomato, and you've seen it sort of grow up and then you go and start something, I think that's solid. I feel like that's the best thing. Corporate, agar aap Infosys mein kaam karte hain, Wipro mein kaam karte hain, apne Ivy League mein kuch padha hai, like I almost think that's either not as relevant or almost thoda bahut liability ho jata hai, mujhe lagta hai, you know, in some ways, because that unlearning process I think has to happen. I mean, I also think so much of entrepreneurship is stamina, right? You're not going to get it right the first time. I feel like, so you have to have the ability to keep going at it, and you have to allow yourself 5 to 7 failures, right, before you hit it. I think there are 2 kinds of phases in life where this makes sense. One is, I think, really early, where you have nothing to lose. You're like 21, 22, 23. Aapke paas hai hi nahi kuch khone ke liye, right? Like you have no dependencies. So I think that's a nice place to go at it. And then I think when you've saved up a reasonable enough corpus, and then you sort of want to go at it. So I don't have a straight answer to your question. What I will say is I think the big brands sometimes become a liability. I think early stage startup experience is great. You've been part of like a founding team or even Series A, Series B.
You've been part of chaos and you understand what didn't work there and what really worked there well.
Yeah.
So you use that as a framework to, this works, this doesn't work.
Right.
And product versus services? No, we're not putting you in a spot, but it's just that...
I do services, first. Again, I think depends on case to case and which sector you're in and what's the background that you come in with. Aap hardware karna chahte ho, software karna chahte ho. I think in general, again, and I speak from a non-technical founder, right? Like business founders, sort of that CEO experience. There, I really think it's very useful to have run a business before you do entrepreneurship. again, I think it's tricky, yaar, because sometimes the rules are different, right? Like, again, there is an unlearning that happens. I spent this entire year in Ahmedabad. And Ahmedabad is as hardcore dhando as it gets, right? Like, they're very like old school businesses.
Center of business in India.
And you learn so much from the people that are there that now adds to what I will bring in. But there's also a bunch of things that they do that are not very relevant anymore.
Right.
You know, like there's a little bit of a mix. So I don't know if there's a straight answer. I think it depends on the person. I think it does depend on what product in what sector. But generally, I think having run some business, like I really like these founders who are like, college mein maine sneakers beche, ya main assessments bechta tha, ya, you know, that sort of
So you
entrepreneurial
understand the
dhanda.
whole cycle of money and how to put the right people, what you're good at, what you're not good at, outsource something.
Correct.
In any business, you will learn that, right?
Some cash flow in your head, some P&L, some
I think-
negotiation.
Like what you're saying is, I think it's also you develop that entrepreneurial mindset
Correct.
in college. Like the example you gave.
Yeah.
If you sell sneakers,
Yeah.
because eventually, if you're not a techie or even if you're techie,
Yeah.
you can build a product when you're 25.
Correct.
But before you build that product, you need that mindset that I want to be an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I have one contrarian point because, again, there's very perceived wisdom. So what Paul Graham says is, if you start a service business,
Yeah.
there's a big chance that you'll get sucked into that.
Yeah.
And then you neglect building product.
Yeah.
So how should founders handle that?
You didn't expect so many tough questions after your
it's
morning
great,
coffee.
I don't feel the pressure to answer it. मैं तो वापस आपको I mean, like, आपको क्या लगता है? I think, no, I don't have the answers, right? I'll tell you from my experience. I almost think, again, I think weirdly, there's a personality type. I think there are some personality types, for instance, that are very consumer. There are some personality types that are very B2B enterprise software. Like, there is just a personality type I think you need if you do like consumer tech, right? Like, I think there's a certain mindset, there's a way in which you've lived life.
You deeply
there's
understand the consumer.
Correct.
You know what his needs are. You know what he does on a daily
But
basis.
how does a founder figure that out? That I'm a B2B guy or a consumer tech guy? Because see, most young kids don't know much
that.
about it, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And especially if you're 24, 25, 2-3 साल ही काम किया है.
Correct.
So how do you figure out कि यार मुझे ये करना चाहिए? This is where my strength lies.
मुझे लगता है you just place a bunch of bets and figure out आपको क्या पसंद है और of course
So you
market
learn by
कहाँ पे
doing
है.
it.
You learn by doing it, or going back to what is the role that early stage investors should play. If you've been an operator and you've thought of these questions and you have some frameworks in your mind, and if you're able to see someone and you're able to be like, दोस्त पता है तू consumer कर यार, you have the flair for consumer, तू try करना, मैं 100% नहीं बता सकता हूँ, but you can save somebody through that kind of wisdom a year of their time, you know. And as investors, you have so much of a vantage point. You've seen so many founders come and go. If you can offer that to someone early on, then they may not even have to learn by doing, because learning by doing is the hard way. It's also the good way. It's the sustainable way. But
Yeah, no, so Pushkar, I mean, from a personal experience, I think for me, travel, talking to people, going, understanding how commerce happens in different places, different countries, cities has kind of enhanced my experience. That's number one. Number two is I ran B2B2C business where I was selling to consumer electronic retailers.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a business where I design something, manufacture in China, ship it to Singapore and Southeast Asia, and then sell it out. But what I did, interestingly, at that particular point in time, I was trying to go and understand consumer behavior. So I was going and walking in all main Orchard Road, going all to the retailers who sell Apple products, etc., to really understand who's coming to the store, what time are they spending in the store, what are they looking at, what are the price points. So it just became very natural to me. So then what I did was I started traveling. And even these days, I don't buy much when I go to the malls. But I'm very keen when I go to Dubai, who's going to which store, what are they buying in cosmetics. So I think it's something that it's a certain amount of curiosity that you pick up, that if you understand this is how the world works, this is how people are trying to market brands, and there has to be a gut level thing of curiosity and how do you sell things, how do you position things. It could be across different categories. So today when I sit and look at businesses, I think, hey, does this product make sense? I'm not biased towards this entrepreneurs building in enterprise SaaS or D2C. Has he thought really deeply about what consumer is trying to sell into? Has he gone there?
How do you assess that whether this product makes sense or not?
You need to probably ask the right questions. You need to ask people who have built in that space. You need to go and experiment. Buy his product, for instance. I mean, like, for example, I remember this very thing that's stuck in my mind is when my friend PC Mustafa was raising money for ID in one of those rounds, the VCs and them were in a conference table. And I remember PC asking the VC, the VC is like, no, we don't, I think they don't get pre-cooked batter and they make batter from scratch or whatever. PC just said, why don't you just call your wife and find out? So the 2 or 3 VCs in the room called their wives and they said, we use this product. So that is validation. So you know so much about the pattern of behavior of that consumer that you're already selling into or who you want to sell into that you kind of know. So this founder that you're trying to assess needs to be deeply thinking about what is the problem he's trying to solve.
Yeah.
And will people pay you top money for that particular product?
Right.
I think it's assessment of personality and it's assessment of curiosity and willingness to kind of really go along. And it doesn't matter whether it's B2C or B2B2C or B2B.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the same trait, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you have to think deeply about the product because think deeply about the product or solution because then you know that entrepreneur is going to go through those periods of pain to solve that problem.
Yeah.
Irrespective of whatever happens.
Right.
That's the way I look at it.
For sure.
And I think it's also interesting that you mentioned curiosity because we always talk about you should be passionate about something, right?
Yeah.
And not many people talk about you should be curious about something.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So whenever you do something, what comes first to you? Your passion, or you say, hey, I'm really curious about this thing.
Yeah. This is a very live question for me right now.
So we're asking you all live questions.
Yeah. It's very good. Like I feel
it's not a startup podcast. It's a live
this
podcast.
is like startup therapy, Like
I think a lot of founders need startup therapy.
Which is the other thing at some point maybe to
talk about.
But is it passion or is it curiosity? I mean, thoda bahut blend hota hai. I feel like for me in education, the passion came first. Like I just think there's something about just learning and something about like the science of learning and children learning and the education system, even adults learning that I'm just passionate about. And I think over there, I would say that my passion led to curiosity because it was
how did you develop your passion?
बहुत luck से हो गया यहाँ वहाँ थोड़ा बहुत
because of studies or you met someone.
It's a nice question. For me, it was exposure. Like
what he's indirectly asking you is, did you date a lot of teachers?
Yeah, but if you did, maybe that.
No, I did.
Teach for India. 5 new teachers. No, we'll cut this part.
It's all good. I think the communications internship, when I saw something and something just clicked for me, ki ye ho raha hai Teach for India mein, I think that was, I feel like, I mean, it's interesting. For some people, it comes, I'm trying to think of where do you recognize your passion? One is कि दोस्तों से आता है कि ये दोस्त कर रहा है, so आपकी exposure वहाँ से हो गई. Like, you're like, oh, you're also doing it. You sort of go there. It's mostly just trial, which is why I think in college and in your teenage years, you should just try 25 things. You'll find passion in 1, 2, 3 of them.
That's a great way of putting it.
Somewhere,
actually.
Right?
Just try a lot of things.
Just go all out.
Especially when you're young.
Especially when you're young. Because again, in those years, you have truly nothing to lose.
Yeah.
Like
there's no downside.
No downside to it. है ही नहीं यार, तुम्हारी जेब में पैसे ही नहीं है.
Right.
तो क्या ही होगा ना? मतलब from like at least 14 to like 22, 23 are golden years to just, just explore a bunch of things and you don't need money. When I say exposure, it doesn't mean you have to travel to like Japan or like whatever it is. Just around, try different things. So I feel like you find that. The curiosity thing is interesting because I have a deep interest in healthcare. And it comes from curiosity. I'm just really interested in all sorts of things, right? Like what is Peter Attia saying? What's Andrew Huberman saying? What's Marcus Rane saying? So I feel like it was first curiosity over there. Ki creatine se kya hota hai? Like what does creatine do for like South Asian bodies? What does magnesium do? So I feel like it was curiosity. And now I sort of feel passionately about it. But in education, it's the other way around.
And I also think like a lot of these founders who are curious, they're also curious about not something which is very niche here. It's more like a personality trait that you're in general curious about how things work.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you said, so
Correct.
you are curious about healthcare,
Yeah.
but you might also be curious about science, something, right, or math.
Yeah, correct, for sure.
So मुझे ये लगता है कि it's very important, like as a founder, because we always keep talking about passion. You should be passionate about something, or you should do something
Yeah.
that you're good at. But
Yeah.
I always think you should have a very open mind.
Yeah,
You should always be trying to figure out how things work,
yeah,
what
Yeah.
drives the world,
yeah,
and then you figure out your niche, right?
Yeah.
Eventually, you'll figure out something you're good at.
The initial period of that exploration and figuring out that passion, and it can be one pillar and multiple pillars, is probably going to build on to the whole perseverance thing. Because when you're really, really passionate about something else, you will persevere, you will have the grit to face shitty situations.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Right? Otherwise, I'm dude, नौकरी के लिए जाता हूँ, ये करता हूँ. You might give up very easily. But once you're really, really, really passionate, I mean,
yeah,
a couple of my friends really, they look at sports teams and athletes across the world, because I think that is a culture. If you can bring that into forming, norming, and building teams,
yeah,
where everybody supports each other and all of that kind of stuff, then you're going to find an outstanding team, right? So I think that passion, if you can find it very early in life,
yeah,
that is only through repetitive probing of different stuff,
yeah,
then you'll have a better, clearer pathway.
Right, right, yeah. If you try 20 things, I'm sure you'll figure out that, first of all, I really want to do this, and also I'm good at it.
correct. And both are important, right?
Yeah,
Like I think,
Yeah.
yeah, it's
So you can be passionate about cricket, yeah, but if you don't have talent, you can't become a cricketer.
correct.
Like building a startup is like playing test cricket, yeah. You're doing it for a really long time. It's not a T20.
Yeah,
And you see a lot of these founders who say, hey, I just want to build it for 2-3 years, make an exit.
yeah,
In my opinion, that's a really wrong approach.
yeah,
If you're building something, you build it for 10 years and forget about exit.
yeah,
Because if you build something interesting, exits will happen. You
Sure.
make money, right? But like the best founders, for their money making is not the central aim.
yep,
They know it will happen. It's a side
Yeah.
effect of if you do something well, money will come, right?
yeah, for sure.
But do you see this in Indian founders? Like how they look at like the founders you speak to? Do they have a longer term vision? What do you think? Like top 2-3 things Indian, most like a very generic again statement, but where Indian founders are good at
Yeah.
and where they are bad at.
Just this point, right? I actually think a lot of us get this wrong. Like I think a lot of Indian founders get it wrong just because the media hype
Yeah.
on how much
Valuation,
money you make,
fundraising.
valuation, VC. Like it's interesting, right? Like we talk a lot about Shark Tank and what it's done for the entrepreneurial ecosystem. I'd like to see over a long term sort of what the impact is, because you've glamorized something that actually is very unglamorous. Once you
This is
get
a
into
little
it,
bit
yeah.
like a South Indian upbringing where you have to be a doctor or an engineer and everybody else is getting grades.
Yeah.
Now they've actually built up the same thing in the startup thing. देख बाजू वाला सुमन की बेटा ने 20 million उठा लिया.
Correct.
तू क्या कर रहा है? You shouldn't say that that's the most important shareholder and stakeholder. You're still building something for a customer. You're solving a customer pain area. Your employees are doing it with you in the trenches. Your vendors are helping you. It's that game. As long as that founding team gets that together, I think they will be able to crack that problem a lot better and not be biased. And look at all the media news. अभी 10 million उठा लिया, अभी तो 100 million उठाने का है, ये valuation में उठाने का है. It's
It's a rat race.
It's a rat race, and it's not a pretty rat race as well.
Yeah.
So, is there anything called a pretty rat race? I don't know. There might be some rat races. We couldn't get to that.
Maybe that analogy of cricket is, I feel like the Jaiswal is the really solid example. I think of an Indian founder just breaks through, right? Like I think as an Indian founder, as an Indian cricketer coming up the ranks, you have to be really resourceful.
Yeah.
Especially if
Know
you
your
come from
limitations,
sort
you
of- correct. And you also know how to break through. Like I feel like in India, where this entrepreneurial spirit, right? Like मैं line काटूंगा नहीं, लेकिन I'll figure out a way to like get my thing done. I feel like in my experience in the US and in India, like I just feel like there's so many people standing in line for what you want. And so I think this hacky nature, right? Like I've just hacked systems to just get through. I feel like Indian founders do that really well, or not intimidated to do it, right? Like you'll just kuch nahi ho raha, you're just going to call somebody, ye figure out kar lo, ye kar lo. Like I just think you'll move a range of pieces. So I think Indian founders are just resourceful. Like you give them, I think, limited resources. I just think they'll do it. I think some of that again in tier 1 city is I feel like some of our tier 1 cities have become almost very westernized, and your founders say the same thing. Like I feel like वही है, मतलब आप अच्छी अंग्रेजी बोल के आप funding उठा लोगे जो भी like.
Yeah,
But I
yeah,
feel like
yeah.
like again, an entrepreneur is supposed to be resourceful. So I feel like Indian founders do that, I think, really well. Of course, I think Indian founders have really strong technical chops, yeah. Like really
For
strong,
sure.
like
Exactly.
technical chops. So I think like Indian founders do that exceptionally well. I think the things that maybe we don't do well is
No, but I think
for
also
example-
Indian founders are to a certain extent very frugal.
correct.
I mean, let's park a lot of other examples that we know, but by and large, a lot of founders are very frugal. I mean, they treat, because of the upbringing that we've had, etc., etc., we treat the money that we get from investors, be it angels or institutional investors, as our own money and spend it in a very judicious fashion. Of course, there are exceptions to this, but I think that's a good skill as well, right? Like, even if you look at the Indian founders in the last 20, 30 years in the Valley, most of the engineering teams are set up here. Because you get more bang for the buck here. Once you realize that a function can be outsourced to another part where it's better and more value, they do that very quickly.
True.
And you were saying about the drawbacks?
Yeah, I think Indian founders have jigra, like that's a nice word. Like heart, yaar, main kar dunga, yaar, main like,
But I think that's part of the culture, right?
Correct. Very much.
Because what you said, frugality, and then you said resourcefulness, and also technical chops. I think this all maybe the Indian culture.
Yeah.
शुरू से बच्चे को बोलते हैं study hard, work hard.
Correct. So I think वो बिल्कुल I think Indian founders में I feel like sometimes what's missing is I think Mark Andreessen and A16Z, I think he's got a really nice blog where he talks about, do you bet on the right founding team or do you bet on the right market? He controversially argues that
Market wins.
The market. He says the market wins, right? I feel like there's a certain element of like just shrewdness or strategic thinking in how you pick your TAM and where the money is going and what's happening that I think is important if you build a VC-backed company. Like if you want to be a unicorn, so much of it is about timing and so much of it is just about strategy, right? Like you have to time it right. I've seen that a little bit more in, I think, my US friends and my
the
US
US
counterparts where you're able to time it. I think exposure is also a little bit more, like so much, like all of cutting edge work is just happening there as well. So exposure thoda zyada hai, yahan pe thoda lag hai. I think the other thing is just bold consumer bets. I think some of the US folks do a lot better. Like I almost think that to build a really strong consumer company, like I think you need to be a little cuckoo. Like you need to have some pulse of something. I think a design aesthetic, like I think
jobs kind of.
Like jobs kind of. I think that sort of helps. I feel like we're thoda bahut conservative, which is why I mean for a range of reasons, not just this, there's a range of reasons why B2B SaaS in India has done well. But अगर आप social media सब बना रहे हो ना, like I think you need also investors that take those bets, and I think I don't know if we have the VC ecosystem in India also to take some of those.
So I think it's getting there, because I think Pushkar, remember the conversation that we had with Arjun a few weeks back, and he was talking about a lot of these consumer companies are now breaking the 100 CR limit, and that is going to go on. Now we don't have a lot of successes that have broken the 500 crore or 1,000 crore limit. But for that, like what you said, you need to have those founders who just think design, Kira, whatever, and there is a little bit of blue ocean, there's a little bit of making category better, etc., etc.
Correct.
But I think the other problem in a place like India is that you have the behemoths like a Marico, like a Reckitt, like a HUL. So once a category is created, these guys have the distribution muscle offline in modern trade that can kill or wipe out any business very quickly. Because at D2C, there is some threshold where you get to 20 million, 30 million impressions, views, etc. Then your cost of customer acquisition goes really through the roof. Unless you built a product like, I mean, Warby Parker. People started wearing Warby Parker. It was a very good product, and Lenskart came in and did the same thing in India. So somebody has to really figure out that word of mouth is your cheapest form of marketing. So you build a product in a category where word of mouth really, really funnels it out, and then that pushes it out on social media. I always take the example of my friends Ixigo, and you met Ashish recently as well. I think brands like Ixigo and other guys have been able to do it at scale. So I think we're still about 5-10 years out to really see those brands come in and make that breakthrough to go on to be either publicly listed companies or get acquired by the large, either global or Indian consumer MNCs.
Right.
At least that's my take on the situation.
Especially in consumer sector.
Yeah, in the consumer
Very
sector.
relevant
Yeah.
for consumer sector.
You need that inherent virality.
Yeah, exactly.
In your product, which I think exists in like beauty, cosmetics. Like there's some inherent virality. I think speaking to someone about just healthcare in general, like even in healthcare, the places that work, they allow for some status signaling.
Yeah.
You know, like I think those are the products that really work. So I think this inherent virality, especially just in this content age that we're in, is so big. It's such a filter when you think of like consumer ideas. Inherent virality, word of mouth.
Because that's the best form, right? I mean, if you can create great, solid content, but at the same time,
Backed by a good product.
Exactly. So that is what I was about to say. You need to still have an 8 on 10 or a 9 on 10 product.
Yeah.
Backed by solid content, solid packaging, solid design.
Right.
That's
which I think the whole truth does really well.
The whole truth is done really
Like,
well.
I think I really like what they do, and just, you know,
Soul Store has done a good job of it, though they're offline. So,
Correct.
I mean, there are brands that are coming about in India, but that.
So this is what you said. The US guys do it really well, right?
Yeah.
At least on the design part. I don't know why, because we
Design का बहुत अच्छा है.
we somehow like the design aesthetics.
Japan, Scandinavia, US, वो design का थोड़ा अलग level पे है ना.
Because
Europe,
we don't read design. We don't study design at school. We don't really have good design.
And we have one institution, yeah. We have NID. Bangalore में सृष्टि है.
Can I talk about something really controversial? I think we're not very good at design because the general lack of curiosity is actually very low.
Could be.
How do you actually build good design? Because, I mean, we're going to be talking to Vyasa as well later, but good design is essentially based on you understanding various patterns, you consuming a lot of information, and then contextually you're looking at a problem and saying, what do I need to pull out and put in there and then sharpen the axe?
Yeah.
So I think fundamentally we as a culture, we are forced into these tracks where we are horses on blinders.
Yeah.
We don't have that spread purview. Like, हम लोग जो बात कर रहे थे ना, by the time you're 22, 23, 24, have you done 20 different things? Which makes you curious and passionate about 2 things.
Yeah. Most of us are trajectory set by the time you're
very
correct.
Set playbook.
Yeah.
You're right. So I just wanted to ask you one more thing, and
I think we'll wrap it up with the 2 questions. Yeah, perfect.
So one thing is when we talk about design,
Yeah.
I think culturally maybe we are not equipped to create good design because you just look at the buildings or the roads or anything that we design.
Yeah.
We do very functional stuff.
Yeah.
In India, it's a way this like it has to work.
Yeah.
It need not look good.
Correct.
But do you think this also comes because maybe our culture doesn't have a lot of risk appetite?
Yeah.
We don't want to make bold bets.
Yeah.
They just like, because see, if you're building a building which is very conservative, it will sell, right?
Yeah.
And you also spend less money on it.
Correct.
So we are always thinking that, hey, let's protect our downside.
Correct.
And in doing that, we maybe don't chase the really upside. Is that a cultural thing?
I think so. It comes back to that frugality wala point, right? Like, which is functional banao bhai cheez. Matlab efficiency chahiye, you know, like just get this built, you know, sasta tikao.
Exactly.
Like, once you go into sasta tikao, jugaad, right? Like,
so I think that's holding back.
So this is what's holding back. But if you see, right, like I think in terms of like, if you actually look at like local Indian design, like if you look at like a Kashmiri Pashmina shawl, if you look at like just what Rajasthan artisans do, like हमारे culture में है. It's just, I think, this modern design that has been taught to us, which is this whole, like, I also have this whole thing of how I think UI UX को ना हमने बहुत मतलब product design को एकदम मतलब modular बना दिया है, चिपका दिया है कि भाई ये बटन है, ये यहाँ पे ये है, मतलब 10 हफ्ते में तुमको सिखा देंगे, अब तुम डिजाइनर हो, and you're like, भाई मैं डिजाइनर हूँ, but तुमको बस वो फिग्मा में तुम मोबाइल स्क्रीन बना सकते हो, and that's good, it's a starting point, but design goes so deep, man. Like I almost these days find graphic designers को ना इतना पैसा नहीं मिलता compared to like product designers or UI UX designers. Again, within that you've got UX designers that are supposed to think differently than you've got UI. I just feel like I enjoy these days speaking to these graphic designers who just have a sense of like creativity that's a lot deeper rather than these modern institute ke, you know, UI designers or even UX is also just so much of it is just like consumer insight, and it takes a while, you know. Like you have to speak to a lot of consumers, like it's very chaotic. Like उसको भी ना हमने एकदम मॉड्यूलर बना दिया कि 10 लोगों से बात करो, ये इंसाइट निकालो, एक अच्छी पीपीटी में दिखाओ और तुमने क्लाइंट को दिखा दिया कि ये लो सर आपका कंज्यूमर इंसाइट। नहीं है यार, ऐसे थोड़ी होता है।
Yeah, exactly.
You have to be a designer. You know, I feel like we've lost that essence. अभी किसी को भी वो डिजाइनर वाला ठप्पा मतलब दे दिया हमने।
दो पॉइंट है आदि। एक तो आई गेट माय डिजाइनर्स who work with us to always, I ask them to think about, put on the third person's hat. Who are you designing for?
Yeah.
If it is for a business and that business is showing it to their consumer, you have to understand the different hats that are there. Think for them, read what you've done and visualize what you've done from their hat.
Yeah.
So that's number one. Number two, the point that we talked about is, I didn't know too much of design, but the more I understood about design and whatever, I think the Indian news and other websites are jol. Basically, I mean, I think about yahoo.com in India and Google, there's a difference. Zameen Asman ka difference hai. Rediff is I don't want to say the explicits, but you know what it is, right? All of these sites, I think India is trained to have the maximum and the lot all out there. Consume all of the information in one shot. They don't think about flow. How does it blend?
Yeah, we
over-optimize. सोचता नहीं है, over-optimize वो बर्ग देता है. Economic Times देखो, ये देखो, Mint देखो, Rediff देखो. Dude, so much of freaking information.
Yeah, I think now we are a scarcity culture. So we are always thinking कि जितना ज़्यादा optimize कर लो. If you have $10, उससे ₹100 का सामान खरीद लो. We don't like to leave time, money, anything on the table.
I think this has been brilliant. I completely enjoyed this conversation. I learned a bunch. And having...
What did you learn?
वो ऐसा मत पूछ रहा हूँ, टेस्ट मैच की बात नहीं करता। इंडिया 4-0 जीतेगा 4. But essentially it was really memorable having two friends on the couch and sharing banter. And I think there's a lot of problem statements that are there. And I think founders of today will have to be mindful of the businesses that they built and basically figure out what is their strengths and go in that direction and path. Does Addy come to us when he bets on the next 0-1 or 0-2?
Yeah, of course.
And I'll bring more people. I really enjoyed our conversation before, where we were talking about why you need more people that think like operators. Like when they invest, and I really enjoyed that conversation. I hope.
Yeah, India में वो culture नहीं है ना operator basis का.
नहीं है. Because ecosystem ही इतना नया है.
So we need to build a solid collective community of people who actually think like us, but at the same time is able to question us.
Correct.
In terms of there's a different point of view.
Yeah.
I totally
sounds good.
Super.
Addy,
thank you.
Lovely. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me and hope to build something together. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
To make one more mention of Beehive, who've been an absolutely amazing host for this podcast series. Thank you so much, guys, for your space. They've got a lot of new spaces in Bangalore. Please feel free to check it out.